Continue with our daily Gemara. We are on Sanhedrin, Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph 112a. I briefly mentioned this before, but I want to make note of this now because I think it's going to be important to frame the Gemara we're about to learn. The Gemara earlier in Daf Ayin Aleph, earlier in this tractate, we didn't learn this because we began studying Sanhedrin with the last chapter, but earlier there's a discussion about whether or not the Ir HaNidachas ever happened. There's one opinion which said that he actually saw the remnant of an Ir HaNidachas, of a castaway city, the city that we've been describing the last few days, where the majority of the city went on to serve idols. And then there's Rabbi Elazar's view, which says Ir HaNidachas that the Ir HaNidachas never happened and never will happen. Similar to the law of the Ben Seder Moira, the rebellious child, which the conditions there are also so difficult to meet that the Gemara basically states it never happened. Likewise, the Ir HaNidachas, as we've been learning all the conditions required to qualify as this castaway city, rather than a bunch of individuals who collectively worship idols, or individually worship idols, to qualify as an actual city that gets judged as an Ir HaNidachas, that gets judged as a castaway city, is the conditions are so difficult that it never happened. The question becomes, if it never happened, it never will happen, why would we spend so much time discussing the laws? On the simple level, it's more Torah knowledge, and the more one studies Torah, the more reward one gets. On a deeper level, however, or within that, what we really mean when we say getting reward is based on that which the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya in chapter 5, where there he extols the virtues of Torah study, and there he explains as follows: considering the fact that Torah is divine wisdom, so when one comprehends it, so then an abstract idea is now unified, becomes one with his mind, with his consciousness. And because the idea here is divine wisdom, the union he makes with with divinity is such that can never be accomplished anywhere else. The idea is in you, and here we're talking about divine ideas, and divine ideas are one with the divine. So divinity, godliness itself, is in the mind that comprehends Torah. And while you're engaged in studying, your mind is invested in it. So it's a two-way union. You're invested in that study, in that godliness, in the godly ideas, and the godly ideas now become in you, part of you. And therefore the Alter Rebbe says, when a person studies a law, we're hypothetical, where one person worked to claim such and such, and so claims a counterclaim such and such, and the law between them be such and such, even if that case would never happen. But that hypothetical is divine wisdom, and therefore understanding it and comprehending it is comprehending it and ingesting, taking into one's mind godliness. And therefore we go forward studying the laws of Ir HaNidachas, and we learn more and more how difficult it is for such a city to ever happen. And as the Gemara states, at least according to one view, it never did happen, never will happen. What's the point of studying and knowing all these things? We should remember that when we study the laws of these hypotheticals, these are ideas that are essentially godly, and thus understanding them is a way of intaking godliness itself. We should appreciate that when we study any Torah, but this gives added flavor when you're studying Torah that is unrelated to practical use, but just pursuing the knowledge for itself, just for the acquisition of taking in more and more divine ideas and connecting more and more of our mind with godliness in and of itself is a worthy cause. So with that, let's go forward in the Gemara. We are 6 lines from the top of the page. The line begins with the word Viktanim, Gridi, and then there's a colon, 2 dots, and then the Gemara reads Acha Yuda Charuba. It quotes the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah text, which the Gemara quoted after the Mishnah, both of which said that a Ir HaNidachas, a city that's been led astray to serve idols, only qualifies once it reaches a majority. And then there's the colon, and the Gemara now analyzes that passage. The Gemara asks, Heichi Avdinon, how does this happen? How would you do it? Considering the fact that we said before each individual person within that castaway city has to have two witnesses that warn the person against idol worship, and then the person says, I don't care, and does it anyway, which means you need to judge each individual person and hear the witnesses of each individual person. How do you ever get to the point of reaching 51%? You have to interrogate hundreds of thousands or millions of witnesses depending on the size of the city. So how do you ever get there? If one person's found guilty, if he is part of the Ir HaNidachas, then it's death by sword and his property gets burnt. But if he's an individual who worshipped idols, then the death is by stoning and his property goes to his inheritors. So when you judge that individual, what do you do with this person? How do you know if you're going to reach 51%? If it's only 49%, then all those people who are judged as individuals people who worship idols, and the law is for them in one way. But if they reach 51%, then they're judged a different way. They're judged as part of the Ir HaNidachas. They're judged as part of the castaway city. And therefore, how do you ever reach it if you're judging each individual person with the witnesses of that individual person? So it says the Gemara, Rav Yehuda says, Donen, they judge each person. And if it's found guilty, v'chovshin, they put them into a kind of jail, a holding cell. Donen, they judge the next person. If he's found guilty, v'chovshin, and they put him into a holding cell. And they leave that person in the holding cell until they reach the point where they know for sure that either they've reached the majority, 51%, and therefore all those people held in confinement or held in some holding cell are judged as the Ir HaNidachas, as the castaway city. And if they don't reach the 51%, then all those people are treated as individuals who worship idols. But Amalei Ula retorts, Nimtza, the result of your program is, says Ula to Rav Yehuda, you are delaying judgment. The law is, once a person, Shalelu, of these people that are held in these holding cells, the law is that as soon as a person is rendered judgment, you have to execute the judgment right away. It's too stressful on the individual. This is a prohibition in Torah, and the reason seems to be because it's too stressful on a person that he knows there's this judgment hanging over him, and it's not being done already. Get it over and done with already. So once you come to a conclusion this person is guilty, you have to exact judgment, whatever the judgment is. In this case, we don't know what the judgment is. Is he an individual who worshipped idols and therefore it's skila, it's stoning, or is he part of a city that worshipped idols and therefore it's by death by a knife? And according to you, Rav Yehuda, where you have to judge each individual and then put them in a holding cell until you get to the point where you know either it's above or below 50%, then this person who's waiting till you get to that point you're delaying his judgment, and that's a prohibition in the Torah. So what's Ula's solution? How do you judge each individual before you know whether they're part of a 51%, before you know whether or not they're part of a city on Ir HaNidachas, or whether they're individuals that failed or that sinned? So therefore, Ula says, Donan v'silkin. You judge each individual. And as soon as the individual is found guilty, you treat him as an individual. And therefore he gets stoned. Now, if it so happened that you get to 51%, then anybody above 50% is considered as part of the castaway city, and those people get put to death by sword. So in other words, 50% of the city will be put to death by stones, because you don't know because at the moment, they're being judged as individuals. And then once you've hit a critical mass of people that you basically put through capital punishment, and you're at 51%, now you start rendering punishment as if they're a city, as if they're Ir HaNidachas, and therefore their capital punishment is by knife. Now all the people all the 50% who were judged as individuals and therefore were killed by stoning, their property will now have to be burned, because part of the law of the Ir HaNidachas, part of the law of the castaway city, is that the property also gets burned. So they would get judgment rendered onto them as individuals. Their property would be confiscated, held, and then if they hit 51% of the city, then those people going forward are killed by knife, and all the property that you confiscated is now burnt. If not, if you don't reach the 51%, then the people who were judged till now were judged as individuals, and their death is by stoning, and therefore the property goes to their inheritors. So this is the two views of Rav Yehuda and Ula. Itmar, we've been taught, as I mentioned before, when the Gemara introduces a teaching with the word Itmar, it means it's a text or teaching from the Gemara's age, from the Amaraic era. And this is from the early Amaraic era, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. two early Amoraic scholars. We have occasion to talk about them before. They're brother-in-laws and study partners. So Rabbi Yochanan said, Danim v'soken. Each individual is judged, and if they're found guilty, they're stoned. And then once you hit 51%, then from there going forward, they are put to death by a knife, as we just described, in the name of Ula. And Rish Lakish says, and this is the third view, he doesn't take the view of Rav Yehuda mentioned before, that you judge each individual, you put them in confinement until you know whether they're part of a city or not, because that would be in violation of the law of pushing off judgment, pushing off exacting punishment. He doesn't go with the law of Rabbi Yochanan, because that means all these individuals which were put to death by stoning should have retroactively been put to death by sword, so they're not getting judged properly. So therefore Rish Lakish says, Mar b'lem batadinin, you just got to hire more judges. You got to make more court cases, got to make more courthouses, and that way everybody can be judged in one day, and then all of these courts can communicate with each other, and they can come to the conclusion whether there was a majority or not. So if you have a city with 100 people, and 60 of them, which is a majority, are suspect of idol worship, and there was two individuals who were two adult men from that city, from that tribe, who convinced those 60 people to worship idols, so they have the conditions of the Ir HaNidachas. Now you got to judge all 60 of them, so Rish Lakish would be, you have to have 60 courthouses, judge each of them, and then all the 60 courthouses would have to communicate with each other and come to the conclusion, is there 51? And thus they're a majority, and therefore they're treated like the Ir HaNidachas, the castaway city, which the property all has got to be burned, and their death is by sword, or they'll come to the conclusion that there's only 49 or less people, anything less than majority. And then each individual is judged as an individual who worshipped idols, thus death is by stoning, and the property is inherited to their inheritors, their children, whoever they happen to be. So this is Rish Lakish's view. Got to make more courthouses, or more judges. Mara asks, Amy, is that the case? Can you just make more judges for them? Can you just make more courthouses for them? More dayanim, more judges? V'amar Rav Chama Rabbi Yosi, Rav Chama son of Rabbi Yosi said, Rabbi Yosi, quoting a verse, verses in Devarim, Perek Chelek, Pasuk Hey, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 5, where it describes taking people who worship idols and taking them to the court that is in your local city. And that's the verse here is, you take them out, El Sha'arecha, to your gates, which is where the judges sit. So the verse there is saying that an individual, man or woman, who worship idols is taken to be judged in the local court. So Ish Isha, an individual man or an individual woman, at the Moitzi L'Sharecha, you take them to the local court at the gate of your city. But you cannot take an entire city, an Ir HaNidachas, to be judged in the local court. They have to be taken to the high court in Jerusalem. The difference between a local court and a court in Jerusalem, besides for the location, is the court in Jerusalem has 72 judges, which makes it a much higher level of judiciary, and they have the highest authority. So judging the law of the Ir HaNidachas, judging the law of an entire city as a castaway city, that has to be taken to the high court in Jerusalem. Now Rish Lakish are arguing that you have to make more court cases locally. That doesn't fit with this law, because this law seems to be saying that this law implies that you can only judge them as a city in the high court in Jerusalem. So Elo, therefore, rather, what we really mean here is Mar b'lem batadinan. You do make more courthouses locally, and they look into their judgment, but they don't converse with each other and decide whether or not there's a majority, because a city cannot be judged by local judges. So each of these courts that you are now making in the local city, the extra ones that you're making for them to be judged, they would each judge an individual. They would come to the conclusion, guilty or not guilty. And then, after they have rendered the individual judgment on the individual people, then then they can all be sent to the grand high court in Jerusalem, and then they conclude the judgment, deciding, yes, there is 51% of people who worship idols, and then they can get their capital punishment. And this is indeed the halacha, as quoted in Rambam, that when there's a city that's a suspect of majority having gone to idols, you have to have extra local courts to judge each individual, and each of them come to a conclusion whether or not he's guilty as an individual, and then collectively they're sent off to be judged in the high court in Jerusalem, and then they render the judgment whether or not the city qualifies as a castaway city, or they're just a bunch of individuals who worship idols rather than a city that gets the special law of the Ir HaNidachas as we described. Okay, Gemara continues. The verse stated that you shall strike the inhabitants of the city. Now, Tana Rabbana and our sages taught, Mishnah H text, elaborating on this verse, and we've had the basic of this law we've already had in the Mishnah, but now the Gemara is going to elaborate a bit more. A caravan of donkeys or of camels that are going from one place to another, and they spend some time in this city. And we mentioned in the Gemara that these people, if they worship idols, then they can tip the scale to make the city from 50% to 51%. Or if these people, this caravan, if they didn't worship idols, they can tip the city the other way and save the whole city from getting the law of the Ir HaNidachas. But how long do they have to be part of the city before they can be counted as the majority, one way or the other? So it says the Gemara. These caravans of donkeys and camels, which go from one place to another, they spend some time in the city, and they have been convinced with the rest of the city to serve idols. If they lived in that city for at least 30 days, then they are killed along with the rest of the city as an Ir HaNidachas, making it the majority, and therefore judged as part of the city, and therefore the death is by knife rather than by stoning, if they were just to be individuals who worship idols. And their property of it is destroyed. Their property is destroyed, like the law of the castaway city, rather than individuals who A, are killed by stoning rather than knife, and B, their property gets inherited. If they spend less than 30 days in the city, then they are judged as individuals who worshipped idols, and therefore their death is by stoning. And their property could be inherited as individual. And the Gemara asks like this. But I'll raise you the following contradiction. I've mentioned before that depending on the way the Gemara introduces the question, we know what kind of question it is. And sometimes the Gemara's question is logical, like a logical counter-argument. Another time it's a contradiction from a higher source, that's we've had in the previous Gemara. That's introduced with the word meisvei or eisvei. Sometimes the Gemara is just inquiring. Then it's introduced with the word boye. And here we have the word ramini, or rami is an abbreviated version of that. And when you have that, it means there's two texts of an equal nature which seem to contradict each other. So in this case, the text we quoted before was a Mishnah H text, and therefore the Gemara challenges that with a equally strong text, a Mishnah H text, a Mishnah. And Amini, you've been taught the following challenge has been raised from another Mishnah. And the Mishnah there is discussing the laws of taxes, shared responsibility of any city. And when someone moves into the city, if someone's traveling through, how long does he have to spend in the city before we start imposing upon him taxes that he has to contribute to the costs of the rest of the city? So it says the Gemara, how long do people have to be dwelling in the city before we start treating them like locals and therefore start to tax them? Says the Gemara, 12 months, a year. Once a person's there for a year, then he's settled in the town and therefore we can charge him. So there seems to be a contradiction. With respect to imposing taxes upon them, they need to be in the city for 12 months. And with respect to being treated as part of the Ir HaNidachas, being treated as part of the castaway city, it's only 30 days that they're part of the city. Amar Rav says, Leikasha, this is not a contradiction. There's a distinction between dwelling in the city and being members of the city. To be members of the city, you have to be there for 12 months. And then they can start getting taxed because they're members of the city. But the verse with respect to the law of the Ir HaNidachas doesn't say b'nei ha'ir, it doesn't say members of the city, it says yoshvei ha'ir, people who dwell in the city. And to dwell in the city is enough for 30 days. So to be judged as part of the city, the castaway city, 30 days is enough because the verse there says yoshvei ha'ir, those who dwell in the city. Whereas with respect to taxing them, they have to not just be dwelling in the city, they have to be members of the city. And therefore, that's 12 months. And the Gemara supports this idea with another Mishnah, a third Mishnah. Vatanya, and indeed we've been taught in the third Mishnaic H text. If someone takes a vow and says, I'm not going to derive any benefit from the members of that city, then his vow is only against people who are members of the city. And thus, if there's a person who lived there for 12 months, you can't have any benefit from it because you vowed to not take any benefit from someone who's a member of the city. And as soon as the person lived there for 12 months, he's a member of the city. If the person lived there for less than 12 months, you're allowed to take benefit from the person because you only vowed against taking benefit from someone who's a member of the city. And this person's not a member of the city because he only lived there for 11 months or for anything less than 12. Now, if he said, I'm not going to have any benefit, not from members of the city. He said, I'm not going to have any benefit from those who dwell in the city. So, if the person lived there for 30 days, you can't have any benefit from it. Because once a person's in a city for 30 days, even though he's not a member of the city, he is considered a dweller of the city. And therefore, if your vow is against those who dwell in the city, even if someone was there just for 30 days, you're not allowed to have any benefit. If the person lived there for less than 30 days, 29 days, 28 days, you're allowed to have benefit from there. So we see here from this Mishnah with respect to the vow is that the distinction between someone who's a member of the city versus somebody who is a dweller of the city. And therefore, with respect to imposing taxes on the locals, they have to be members of the city, and therefore only if they're there for 12 months. But with respect to the law of the Ir HaNidachas, with respect to qualifying as part of a castaway city, where the verse says Yoshvei Ir, those who dwell in the city, then it's enough for 30 days. Okay, we're going to stop over here. And God willing, tomorrow we'll continue with details on the process of destroying and getting rid of the property of this castaway city. Have a wonderful day. And if you're in Montreal, please enjoy the nice weather.